Ryusei's hands are shaking. Not from fear. The most dangerous alpha in Yokohama does not shake from fear. He shakes because Sora is burning up in his arms, and Ryusei Kondo, the man rival families negotiate with because they are too afraid to face his uncle, cannot stop it, cannot fix it, can only hold him. Sora cannot hear the word Ryusei keeps saying against his throat, but he feels it, vibrating through skin and bone, and the connection they never planned for. Stay, stay, stay. A Def Omega, an Alpha Dawn, and a love that was never supposed to survive either of them. If you want to hear the full uncensored story, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. His hand was already in mine before I realized what I had done. That is the part I cannot explain, even now. Not the biological avalanche that followed, not the 9 stops Ryusei Kondo rode past his destination without once loosening his grip. Not the way the most feared alpha in the Kawagari syndicate sat perfectly still in a subway car while my thumb moved in slow, unconscious circles against his knuckle, and he let me, because apparently neither of us had received the memo about what we were supposed to be to each other. The part I cannot explain is the moment before all of that. The moment where my hand simply moved, the way it had always moved in the dark, reaching for something I could not hear coming, reaching for stability in a world that communicated in frequencies I had not had access to since I was 4 years old. My hand reached and found his, and something in me said yes, and I did not pull away. My name is Sora Yashima. I am 26 years old, and I am profoundly deaf, and I have spent most of my life becoming very good at reading the world through touch and light and the vibrations that move through surfaces the way sound moves through air for everyone else. I read lips when the speaker faces me, and the light is right. I read hands when someone has bothered to learn sign language, which in my experience is approximately 7 people, 4 of whom are paid to know it and 1 of whom is my sister. I read facial expressions, and the set of shoulders and the quality of stillness in a body when it is afraid, and I have become, over 26 years of necessary observation, something of an expert in what people mean versus what they show. I did not read Ryusei Kondo, not at first. At first, he was just a hand. The Iraku line runs northeast on Tuesdays, and that particular Tuesday was the kind of October afternoon that makes Yokohama feel like the inside of a bruise. The rain had started around noon, and by 3 it was sheeting against the platform glass with the specific gray intensity that collapses the boundary between sky and street. I had been on my feet for 11 hours, at the community center where I work as an interpreter facilitator, connecting deaf clients with social services, and my body had the particular leaden quality of someone who has been using focus the way other people use oxygen, relentlessly, without break, for the better part of a workday. I found a seat on the 347 train, window side, second car. I had my phone in my lap and my bag between my feet, and I was watching the rain tracks slide down the glass when the train lurched, late passengers boarding, and the person who sat down beside me hit the seat with enough force that my equilibrium tipped. My hand grabbed the nearest available thing, which was his. I knew immediately that I had grabbed a person rather than a rail. The warmth was wrong for metal. The texture was wrong. Skin and something else. A raised irregularity across the back of the hand that I registered as scar tissue even before I had turned to look. And then I turned to look, and the look hit me somewhere behind my sternum and stayed there, stuck, because the man beside me was not someone I would have reached for voluntarily in any universe where I was making conscious decisions. He was big in the way that belongs to people who have never needed to make themselves small, not aggressively large, just fundamentally, quietly enormous, the kind of physical presence that reorganizes the space around it without effort. His suit was dark and expensive, and slightly damp at the shoulders from whatever those shoulders had walked through before reaching this train. His jaw was the kind of thing that belongs in an architectural drawing, clean angles and deliberate lines, and his eyes, which had turned toward me the instant my hand closed over his, were the color of deep water at night and currently doing something I had never seen eyes do before. They were absolutely still, not blank, not empty, still, in the way that deep water is still, in the way that something is still when it is paying the most complete attention possible and making no effort to show it. I should have let go. Every instinct I had that was still operating rationally was transmitting that signal with urgent clarity. Let go. Apologize. Gesture at the motion of the train. Universal language for my bad. Accident. Not intentional. Normal human behavior for an Omega who had just accidentally grabbed the hand of a man whose entire physical presentation said do not touch. I did not let go. That was the part I could not explain. My hand stayed around his. My fingers curled over his knuckles, the scar tissue I had registered in that first second of contact, running beneath the third and fourth fingers of my grip, like a topographic map of something survived. And my thumb, operating on some kind of deep, muscular autopilot that apparently had not received the emergency bulletin from my rational brain, made that slow circle against his skin. He did not pull away either. The train moved. The rain tracked down the glass. The fluorescent lights in the car did their usual flicker as we passed under the Takashima Junction. That specific, irregular pulse that I had learned to anticipate over years of riding this line, and I watched his face because I watch all faces. It is how I navigate existence, and what I saw in it made my heart do something complicated. Nothing. He showed nothing. And yet his hand, the hand I was holding without permission, had gone very carefully still, as though any movement might break something that had not finished forming. 3 stops went by. I know it was 3 because I count them compulsively, the way all deaf riders count, maintaining an internal inventory of position because the announcements are not for me. Kandamachi. Miraicho. Nishioka. He did not move. He did not look away from the forward middle distance he had fixed his attention on with the discipline of a person who has trained himself not to betray anything. But the hand in my grip, that large, warm hand with its scar-mapped knuckles, remained completely, utterly surrendered. I became aware of something else gradually, the way you become aware of a scent when you have been inside it long enough that the acclimation reverses and you suddenly notice what you were breathing all along. His pheromone signature, which I had been processing without processing it, the way bodies process information they have not been given conscious permission to receive, suddenly arrived in my awareness with the weight of something dropped from a significant height. Alpha. Deeply, structurally, comprehensively alpha. The kind of pheromone signature that does not broadcast so much as it saturates. A presence that fills available space the way weight fills a vessel. Quietly, completely, without announcement. And underneath, or behind, or threaded through, a secondary note that I had never encountered before and would later spend considerable time trying to name. It was not warmth exactly. It was closer to the quality of light through glass, filtered and concentrated, something that existed under the visible surface of his composure like heat through a wall. My Omega biology received this information and made several unauthorized decisions simultaneously. A flush spread up from my sternum that had nothing to do with embarrassment, the kind of heat that originates below thought and works its way outward through the body, like an answer to a question the body has been holding for a very long time. The place low in my abdomen that stays quiet on suppressants, quiet and flat and manageable, flexed once with a sharp insistence that made me press my knees together with my free hand still carefully, stubbornly, inexplicably wrapped around his. I had not gone into heat in 2 years. My suppressants were consistent, and my dosing was careful, and I had built my entire adult life around the principle of not being vulnerable to biology in public, not being the Omega whose control slipped at inconvenient moments, not being the thing I had been told an Omega with no voice was at risk of being manageable, contained, self-sufficient to the point of aggressive isolation. His scent cracked the wall, not all at once, not catastrophically. A fracture, the kind that starts as a hairline and spreads with the patience of something that has been waiting for exactly the right pressure in exactly the right place. My suppressants were still functioning. I was not in heat. But something in the pheromone signature of the man whose hand I was holding without his explicit consent had identified a frequency in me that my body recognized at a level below conscious thought, and my body had identified his in return, and the recognition between them was doing something quiet and devastating to my carefully maintained equilibrium. I was staring at him. I realized this the way you realize you have been doing something for longer than you thought, the way the moment of noticing arrives after the fact. I was staring at the side of his face with the full, unguarded attention of someone who has forgotten to maintain the social calibration that prevents this, and he knew I was staring because he turned. His eyes met mine with a directness that would have been aggressive if it had contained any aggression at all. It did not. What it contained was a question, the simplest possible question, asked by 2 eyes in the kind of perfect silence I actually lived in, and the question was, why? Not why are you still holding my hand? Not why are you staring? Just why, open-ended, like he was willing to accept whatever answer I gave, regardless of what it turned out to be. I did not have an answer. Or rather, I had the wrong kind of answer, the kind that had no language attached to it yet, the kind that existed purely as sensation and the embarrassing warmth spreading from my abdomen into my throat. I let go. My hand released his, and I turned back to the rain-tracked window and pressed my free fingers into my palm because they were still warm from his skin, and the warmth was distracting. And outside the glass, Higashimoto Station was pulling alongside the platform and the doors were opening, and this was where he was supposed to get off. I know it was Higashimoto because I had been watching, the way I always watched, the way deaf people learn to watch when the recorded announcements are not accessible and the station name boards are your only navigation. The train stopped. The doors opened. Commuters shifted, shuffled, pressed toward the exits with the mechanical crowd urgency of Tokyo Transit at 3:50. He did not move. I felt this more than saw it, the specific quality of someone who is not getting up, the stillness of a body that has made a decision and is not advertising it. I turned, because I turned toward everything that changed in my vicinity. It was reflex, survival instinct, dressed as curiosity, and he was looking straight ahead with the composure of a man who had absolutely and definitely meant to stay on this train past his stop. My heart made that complicated thing again, more complicated this time. The doors closed. The train moved. Nishiura slid by, then Hanekawa, then the long curve before Oimachi that always made the overhead lights flicker in that irregular double pulse that I had years ago stopped finding startling. Through all of it, he sat beside me, not touching. The 6 centimeters of seat between us might as well have been a surveyed property line, exact and deliberate, but present, comprehensively, undeniably present. At Oimachi, I did something that I cannot fully account for. I opened my phone and typed into the Notes app with the practice speed of someone who has been doing this their whole life, using digital text the way other people use voices, and I turned the screen toward him. "You missed your stop." He read it. I watched his eyes move with the particular economy of someone who reads quickly and does not perform the act. Then he turned and looked at me, and something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, too restrained to call a smile, but a movement that acknowledged something. "I know," he said, or shaped with his mouth. I watched his lips and I knew it was those words because I had been reading lips for 22 years and I was very good at it. Then he took out his own phone, typed something, turned the screen toward me. "You have cold hands." I stared at this. It was so far from anything I had expected, any of the several categories of response I had been preparing for. Not confrontational, not dismissive, not the polite social flinch of a stranger who has had an unwanted interaction and wants it neatly concluded. Just that. An observation, offered without judgment, about the temperature of my hands, which were in fact always cold because I ran cold and always had, and my sister called me lizard-blooded, which I had eventually decided to interpret as affectionate. I looked at him. He looked at me. The train moved northeast through the gray October afternoon, and outside the windows, Yokohama gave way to the less curated sprawl of the transit corridor, laundry on railings and the backs of buildings that were not designed to be seen. I typed, "They're always cold. It's a circulatory thing." He typed, "Mine are always warm. I've been told it's a character flaw." Something happened in my chest. A small, distinct thing, like a key turning in a lock I had forgotten I had. I looked at his hands, the hands that had been warm under mine for the better part of 3 stations, and I thought about the scar tissue under my fingers and about the character of stillness I had felt in his body when I grabbed him and did not let go. I typed, "What's your name?" The screen came back, Ryusei. One word, no surname. The practiced concision of someone who either values privacy or has learned that too much information travels faster than you want it to. I filed this. I typed, "I'm Sora. I'm deaf. In case that's useful information going forward." He looked at this for a moment. Then he typed, "I guessed. You haven't looked away from my face since you sat down." I felt warmth climb my throat. He was right. Lip reading required sustained facial attention, and I had been giving him exactly that. And while to me it was a navigation tool as fundamental as sight, to the hearing world it often registered as staring, as intensity, as a quality of attention that made people uncomfortable. I had been told this. I had been self-conscious about it most of my life. I typed, "Does that bother you?" He typed, "No." Then, after a pause during which the train made the Higashiura stop, and several more people got off and no one got on, and the car grew quieter. "It's the most anyone has looked at me in years." I did not know what to do with that sentence. It sat in the middle of the phone screen between us, and I read it 3 times, and each time it landed differently, the way something lands when it is a small sentence carrying very large contents. I looked at him, and he was looking at the phone still. The way you look at something you have just released from a private place and are not entirely sure you meant to, and the set of his jaw had something in it that I spent several seconds trying to name. Loneliness. I knew loneliness. I knew the specific variety that belonged to people who existed adjacent to a world rather than inside it. I had lived in that variety for most of my life, but I had not expected to recognize it in the face of a man who was physically constructed like a monument and whose pheromone signature said authority the way certain buildings said wealth, quietly and without apology, in a language so fundamental it did not need to be announced. The train made Minamiyota, made Tatsumi, made Umeda Nishi with its distinctive platform mural of herons in flight that I had been using as a navigation landmark for 3 years. 8 stops past Higashimoto. 8 stops past where he was supposed to get off. We had been typing back and forth. "What do you do?" I had asked. "Work," he said. "What kind?" I asked. "The kind that requires being somewhere you would rather not be," he said. I had taken a moment to consider this, and then typed. "That describes most employment." He had shown the corner of his mouth again, that not quite smile. There had been something specific and rare about it. The way things are rare when they are not often deployed. He asked what I did, and I told him, and something shifted in his face that I did not immediately know how to read. "Interpreter facilitator at a deaf community center," I had typed. He had looked at this for a long time, longer than it warranted from a reading speed perspective, and then typed, "You make sure people are heard." "Yes," I typed. He typed, "Good work." The simplicity of it struck me harder than it should have. Not impressive or interesting or unusual. The words hearing people usually reached for when they learned about my work. Good. A quality judgment. An ethical one. I had noticed, by now, several things about him that I was filing without announcing I was filing. His hands had stilled completely when he was reading. The quality of attention he gave the phone screen was the same quality I had seen in his eyes on the train, deep and total and unperformed. He occupied his physical space with the relaxed authority of someone who has never had to justify being where they were, but his face, stripped of that authority, was something different. When he showed something, he showed it as though he was not used to showing things and had not built the usual social cushioning around the habit, raw in a very controlled way, like something living carefully inside something else. At Umeda Nishi he typed, "Where are you going?" I typed, "Kasumigaoka. 4 more stops." He typed, "I'll ride." Not "I'll ride with you," just "I'll ride." A statement of intention, offered plainly, without the social performance of asking permission or framing it as a question I could refuse. My heart made the complicated thing a 3rd time, and this time I let it, because it was becoming clear that this was going to be the kind of afternoon that simply happened and could not be managed into any other shape. I typed, "You're very far from wherever you were going." He typed, "I know where I am." I believed him. There was nothing about Ryusei Kondo that suggested he was anywhere by accident. We rode the last 4 stops in the way we had been riding, in the specific shared silence of 2 people who have found a language that works between them and are not rushing to fill it with anything else. My phone was between us on the seat, the Notes app open, a record of everything we had said to each other scrolling up the screen like a conversation in a language we had invented together in the space of 7 stops. Outside the glass the rain was easing, the sky going from bruise gray to something lighter that might eventually decide to be dusk. At Kasumigaoka I stood and he stood with me, and we exited onto the platform without either of us acknowledging that he was not supposed to be here, that this was not his stop, that he had ridden 9 stations past the station I had watched him not exit. The platform was mostly empty in the post-rush hour lull. The overhead lights were the warm yellow of tube fluorescence, casting the specific flatness of artificial light over wet platform concrete. He stood in front of me, big and still and slightly damp at the collar, and looked at me with those deep-water eyes, and said with his mouth, "Can I see you again?" I read his lips, and then I looked at him for a moment. Really looked, the way I was permitted to look because I was deaf and looking was my language, and I saw the precise quality of the question, not the bravado of an alpha who expects yes, not the calculation of a man who is deciding whether something is worth his time, something far simpler and considerably more dangerous. He wanted to see me again. I typed my number into his phone. He gave me his. We stood for another moment on the empty platform while the departing train drew its wind through the station, and I felt it in my hair and on my skin. And then, I walked through the exit gate, and he stayed on the platform, and when I turned at the top of the stairs, he was still standing there, hands in his pockets, watching me go with the expression of someone who had just made a decision they were going to have to live with. I walked home in the light rain with my heart doing things I did not have names for yet. The first message came that night at 11:47, which I know because I keep my phone on vibrate, and the buzz woke me from the specific light sleep I maintained when I was expecting something without knowing what. It said, "Still cold?" I lay in my dark apartment and read this, and the warmth that moved through me had nothing to do with my blanket. I typed, "Warmer." "You?" He typed, "Warmer." I stared at the ceiling for a very long time after that. His name in full was Ryusei Kondo, and I learned what that meant over the next 72 hours in increments that arranged themselves like notes of a melody I had been hearing wrong, until the full chord sounded and I understood what I was listening to. The Kowagari Syndicate. My friend Benny told me in the coffee shop the morning after the train, her face doing careful things while her hands signed because Benny was one of the 7 people, and she knew this was the kind of information that required signing and eye contact simultaneously. She had searched the name because she knew me and knew that I would not have given my number to someone on a train without reason, and the reason must have been significant, and she wanted to know. Second tier. Not the head of the family, she signed. The head is his uncle. But Ryusei runs the distribution and enforcement. He is the one the other families negotiate with when they want something without going to the top. She gave me the look she gave me when she was not going to tell me what to do but was making very clear that she had opinions. I received the look and read it accurately and looked at my coffee. What she did not say, because she was Benny and understood me, was that I should not have given him my number. She knew I already knew that. She also knew that knowing it and acting on it had apparently not occupied the same space in me. I typed to him that evening. "I looked you up." The response came fast. "I expected you would." I typed, "You should have told me." He typed, "Would you have given me your number?" I sat with this for a long time. The honest answer was that I did not know, and the honest answer underneath that was that probably not, and the honest answer underneath that was that this specific probably not was a loss I would have felt. I typed, "I don't know." He typed, "Neither do I. That's why I didn't." And then, after a pause, "Does it change things?" I looked at my apartment walls, at the plant on the windowsill that I kept alive by feel because I could not hear it struggling, at the framed photograph of my sister and me taken before I lost my hearing when I was 4. 2 small children with our mother's hands on our shoulders, both of us looking somewhere off camera at something that must have been loud because my face in the photograph was turned toward the sound of it, turned with the instinct I would lose and spend the rest of my life compensating for. I typed, "I don't know yet." He typed, "Fair." We met again on Friday. He chose a coffee shop near the community center, which I noted, because it was in my territory rather than his, a choice that carried a specific kind of intention. The coffee shop had good acoustics in the sense that the walls absorbed rather than reflected, which did not help me but which made it easier to lip read because there was less visual noise from the vibrations of the space. I mention this because he had chosen it for exactly that reason, which I understood only after he showed me on his phone the note he had typed before arriving. Good light, less crowded, easier for lip reading. He had researched what made a space accessible. I sat across from him at a small table by the window and I looked at him in the gray afternoon light, and the thing I had felt on the train, that key turning in the locked room, turned again and held. He was wearing something less formal than the suit from the train. Dark sweater, dark jacket, the same expensive understated quality that everything he wore carried, but the formality was lower, and in its absence he looked like someone who was trying something out. Someone who was not entirely sure this version of himself was going to hold together under observation, but who had decided to attempt it anyway. I signed hello out of habit, then remembered and reached for my phone, but he had already pulled out his and typed, "Hello." And then he typed something else and turned the screen to show me, and what it showed was a full sentence in beginner-level Japanese sign language, rendered in the choppy, romanized transliteration of someone who had learned from a video or a website in the last 48 hours. He had been studying. It was not fluent. It was not even close to fluent. But the characters were correct, and the sentence was, "I am learning. Please be patient." I looked at the screen. I looked at him. The warm thing in my chest expanded with an urgency that pushed against my sternum from the inside. I signed back, "You did good," taking my hands and correcting the shape of the first word, showing him the difference between the sign he had approximated and the actual form. Because the best thing I could give him was honesty, And the honesty here was that what he had done was try. And trying was what I asked of everyone who entered my life and was given to me by almost no one. He watched my hands with the same total quality of attention I had identified on the train. Not polite attention. Not performative attention. The actual thing, fully deployed, storing what he saw. We spent 2 hours in that coffee shop communicating in the hybrid language we were building. Phone, when the ideas were complex. My lips, reading his, the sustained facial attention that hearing people found uncomfortable and which he received with the same composure he had shown on the train, meeting my eyes every time I looked up from his mouth. He told me things that were not easy to tell. Not the syndicate things, not yet, but the interior things. He had 3 people he considered friends, which he said without self-pity, the way you say something that is simply true. His family was his uncle's family, the Kawagari family, and he had been inside it since his parents died when he was 13, which also landed simply, not an appeal for sympathy but a fact that explained other facts. He signed clumsily on the phone screen, showing me a translation app he had already downloaded and started using. Mostly history, military history, the geography of conflicts. I told him about sound, about the specific quality of before, which I remembered imprecisely and reconstructed constantly from context, about the things I had learned to hear with my body instead, the vibration of music through a floor, the weight of a voice through a hand pressed to a throat, the way buses announced themselves in the bones of the pavement before the visual of them appeared. He listened to this the way he listened to everything, with his full face, with those still eyes. At the end of 2 hours I stood to leave and he stood with me and we were in the narrow space beside the table and his face was close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, that pheromone signature I had been breathing for 90 minutes, saturating my peripheral senses, doing the quiet fracture work on the wall I maintained around my biology with such disciplined consistency. He signed, slowly and incorrectly, but unmistakably. Next week? I signed back, correcting the shape of his hand first, bringing his fingers into the right configuration. Next week. His mouth made the not quite smile. I read it as something it was not supposed to be showing me. Happiness. Simple, unguarded, briefly uncontained happiness, like something that had gotten out before he could check it. I walked to the door with my pulse, doing things that were entirely my own fault. And in the space behind my ribs where everything I had not yet let myself name was living, something moved. Something that had been waiting since a train lurched at the wrong moment and my hand found his. Something that knew, with the specific certainty of the body, that this was not a beginning I could put away cleanly when it became inconvenient. That whatever Ryusei Kondo was, whoever he was, the man inside the composed exterior, the man who learned signs in 48 hours and researched good lighting and said, I know with the calm authority of someone who never ended up anywhere by accident, that man was going to matter in ways I had not built walls tall enough to contain. The question that followed me down the stairs and out into the rainy Yokohama afternoon was not whether he was dangerous. I knew what the Kawagari name meant. I had read it in Benny's careful hands, and in the space between her words, and in the look she had given me over her coffee cup, the look that meant I have opinions, and you already know them. The question was what I was going to do with a warmth in my chest and a fracture in my suppressant wall and a man whose scent had been taking me apart patiently for weeks and who had signed, in letters he had learned for me, in a language he was building for me the way he built at everything, with focused, systematic care and the patient attention of someone who was planning to stay. Next week. Next week. I held it in my chest the whole walk home, that simple, enormous word. And the rain came down and the city went about its inaudible business around me and I thought about what it was going to mean when next week arrived. When we were in the same room again and his scent was doing its quiet catastrophic work and I was out of excuses for the thing I had been looking at sideways since a train car and a grabbed hand and 9 stops that changed the shape of everything. I thought about his eyes, that specific deep water quality, paying complete attention to whatever they were attending to and showing none of it. I thought about them attending to me. And in the dark behind my sternum the key turned one more time in the lock it had been turning since Eriku Line, 3:47, a Tuesday in October, and the sound it did not make was very loud. The deaf Omega held the Alpha Don's hand on the subway. He rode 9 extra stops without moving. Next week arrived on a Saturday. He did not announce it with a text or a plan. He showed up. The buzzer vibrated through my kitchen counter at 9 in the morning, and I knew from the quality of the vibration, the single deliberate press, rather than the apologetic repeated tapping of someone uncertain of their welcome, that it was him. I pressed the intercom button to release the door and stood in my apartment in the particular suspended way of someone who has been waiting for something without admitting they were waiting. He came through the door with 2 coffees from the place 3 streets over and snow in his hair from the overnight fall that had turned Yokohama the color of paper. He shook it out in my entryway and looked at me and signed, slow and careful and slightly wrong in the second hand shape but unmistakably the words, "Good morning." I corrected his hand without thinking, the way I corrected everything, reaching out and reshaping his fingers into the proper configuration, holding them there for a moment until the form registered. His eyes were on my face the whole time, not on his own hand. He was always watching my face. He had learned early that my face was where I kept the translation. I signed back, "Good morning." He brought coffee. He signed the new word he had learned that week, one I had not taught him, which meant he had been studying independently again. Yes. And then he showed me his phone where he had typed, "I looked up your order." The app remembered it from the last time we were near this coffee shop. I hope that isn't strange. I looked at this. A man who ran a syndicate's distribution and enforcement had memorized my coffee order from a digital trace. I thought about the ways this could be frightening and concluded it was not, which probably said something about where I had arrived relative to common sense. I typed, "It isn't strange. It's the most anyone has paid attention to my coffee in my adult life." He sat on my couch and I sat across from him and we drank coffee in the quiet of my apartment in the specific Saturday morning quality of light through snow-bright windows, and it was so ordinary it was extraordinary, because ordinary had not been a thing I experienced in the presence of another person very often. Ordinary meant comfortable. Ordinary meant the armor was somewhere else. The suppressants were holding. I had increased the dose and my body, trained by years of consistent management, had accepted the correction, and the fracture from the coffee shop had sealed to something that felt stable if not entirely quiet. There was still the warmth. There was still the awareness of him that lived in my skin when he was in a room, but it was managed, and I was managing it, and I had decided that managing it was acceptable as long as I remained honest about what it was. After the coffee he asked, on his phone, "Can I show you something?" I typed, "Yes." He drove again. Different direction this time. North along the coast, the snow landscape outside the windows making everything unfamiliar and clean. He did not tell me where we were going, and I did not ask because I had established fairly early that asking Ryusei Kondo where something was going produced less information than simply going there and observing. He parked at a small shrine on a hillside above the city. Stone steps, heavy cedar gates, the specific stillness of a place that expected quiet. Snow on the stone lanterns, on the rope of the bell, on the flat offerings trays. We walked up the steps. Our breath was visible in the cold. He walked slightly behind me and slightly to my right, which I had come to understand was deliberate positioning, the place from which he could see my face in profile and know if something in the environment required my attention before I noticed it myself. He had started doing this without comment in the 3rd week, this quiet sentinel placement, and it had taken me until the 4th week to consciously register what it was. At the top of the steps we stood before the main hall and he typed, "My mother came here. Every New Year. It was the only shrine she went to and I don't know why she chose this one. I came here the year after she died and I have come every year since. It's December next week." I read this. I looked at the shrine, at the way the snow collected on the caves of the roof and turned the edges of everything soft. I thought about a 13-year-old boy coming to this hillside alone because he was retracing a ritual that had belonged to someone he could no longer follow anywhere else. I typed, "Thank you for bringing me here." He looked at the screen and then looked at the shrine, and in his profile there was something that had no containment strategy. Raw in the way he was only occasionally raw, when something slipped past the architecture he had built around himself, and I received it the way I received everything he showed me without armor, with complete and undivided attention, because this was a person who rarely showed things and I was not going to look away when he did. We stood there for a long time, in the cold, at his mother's shrine, not talking, his shoulder pressed against mine. The snow came down in the specific slow way of snow that has decided to commit. I thought about the boy who had become this man, the particular loneliness of inheriting grief and a family that was not quite a family, and I thought about my own particular loneliness, the variety that belonged to living in a sound-based world from behind glass, and I thought that there were many kinds of silence, and this one, standing next to Ryusei in the snow at his mother's shrine, was the least lonely silence I had inhabited in 26 years. He typed, eventually, "I haven't brought anyone here before." I typed, "I know." He looked at me. I could feel the question in it even before his face moved. I typed, "The way you looked at the gate when we arrived. Like you were deciding whether to let someone into a room you usually keep locked." I saw it. Something went through his expression. The quality of being read accurately by someone who was not supposed to be able to read him. He typed, "You see things that other people miss." I typed, "I had to learn to. It was the only way to know what was happening around me, but I think you let me." He typed, "What do you mean?" I typed, "Most people maintain more opacity. You are contained. But the containment has gaps that you don't close when I'm looking. I don't know if you're aware of it." He sat with this for a long time, long enough that the snow had laid a thin layer on his shoulders. He typed, "I think I leave them open deliberately. I think I've been doing it since the train." My heart made the complicated thing again, the fourth or fifth iteration of it, each one slightly larger than the last. I did not type anything back. Instead, I reached out and took his hand, the way I had on the train, my cold fingers finding his warm ones. And this time, it was not an accident, and we both knew it, and neither of us performed the pretense that it needed to be explained. He closed his fingers around mine. We stood at his mother's shrine in the December snow and held hands and said nothing at all. And in the silence that was my native language and his chosen one, something between us completed a circuit it had been building toward since October. The weeks between December's shrine visit and the New Year were the weeks where the careful architecture of our communication became something else. Not less careful, more inhabited. The way a house becomes different from a structure when someone starts to know which boards creak and which windows face the morning. He learned the sign for my name. Not the finger-spelled version, the proper name sign, which in deaf culture is given rather than chosen, a sign that encodes something about the person's nature or the first impression they made. He asked me to teach him, and I showed him twice, and on the third time his hand did it correctly. The fluid motion that signed not just my name, but the particular quality of the way I looked at things. And when he signed it, I felt it in my chest like a note played in exactly the right key. He told me things in increments. The shape of the Kowagari operation, not the details, not the specifics that would constitute testimony, but the structure of his days, the meetings, the negotiations, the specific geography of being the person who occupied the space between the public face of a criminal organization and its actual working machinery. He told these things without apology and without glamour, the way you tell someone the shape of your work when you trust them to receive it accurately rather than impressionistically. I told him things too, about the community center and the clients I worked with, the specific work of being the person who ensured that people without access to the dominant communication system could still access services and rights, and the machinery of a society that was not built with them in mind. I told him about my mother, the hearing woman who learned sign language for me at 42 and who was still alive, in Osaka, sending me careful emoji-laden texts that I kept in a folder labeled Mom because the specificity of her emoji choices was its own language. He asked about her once, on his phone, a careful question, and then a week later he sent me a message that said, "I looked up late-onset sign language acquisition rates. Your mother's fluency timeline is in the top 12%. She worked very hard for you." I sat with that for a long time. The thing it meant, that he had researched my mother's achievement in order to understand the scale of it, in order to give it its proper weight. I typed, "She did. She still practices." He typed, "Tell her she did well." I told her. She sent back 17 heart emojis and a single hand emoji that she had recently learned was the sign for "I love you" and deployed with enthusiasm in all contexts. I showed Ryusei this exchange and he made the not quite smile in full, and then he signed the "I love you" hand sign himself. Slowly, not to me, practicing it, learning it for future use, and I watched his large, scarred hand make this small, careful gesture, and I thought I was in significantly more danger than I had accounted for. January came. The new year arrived with the specific combination of fireworks and temple bells that I experience as vibration through floors and windows, and I sat in my apartment and felt the city celebrating around me in frequencies I translated through my body, and I thought about Ryusei, at his mother's shrine, doing whatever he did, there alone, on New Year's Eve, and I sent him a message at midnight, "Happy New Year." He sent back, "Happy New Year. Are you watching the lights?" I typed, "I can feel them. The fireworks. Through the floor." He typed, "Tell me what that's like." Nobody had ever asked me that before. Not in that way, not with the genuine curiosity of someone who wanted to understand the texture of my experience rather than confirm their assumption about what it must be like. I sat on my floor and pressed my palms flat against the wood and felt the city shaking itself into the new year, and I described it to him for 15 minutes. The quality of bass frequencies through floorboards, the difference between a firework and a truck, between a concert and a storm, and he read every word and then typed, "Thank you for showing me that." We saw each other twice in January, once for dinner and once for a walk through Yamashita Park that became 3 hours because neither of us noticed the time. In February, he cleared an afternoon for me without saying it was cleared. I understood it only from the quality of his availability, the way he was fully present rather than divided, and we went to an aquarium where the floor-level tanks created a vibration against the glass that I could feel through my palms when I pressed them there, and he stood beside me and pressed his palm next to mine and said with his mouth, reading myself, "What do you feel?" I put his hand flat against the glass where mine was, and the vibration passed through both of us simultaneously, and I looked at his face while he felt it for the first time, and saw him understand something that had no language except sensation. Through all of it, the warmth, the persistent, patient, carefully managed warmth that lived in my lower body every time his pheromone signature arrived in my space. The suppressants were holding, but holding was the right word for it, the word that implied active maintenance, ongoing effort, a grip rather than a resting state. I was aware of it the way you are aware of carrying something that requires care, the specific peripheral attention of someone who cannot put the thing down but cannot afford to think only about the thing they are carrying. I had not told him it was getting harder. I had told him, in November, that the direction of travel was concerning, and that had been true, and was more true now, but I had not updated the report because updating the report required sitting in the truth of what was happening in my body, and I was not entirely ready to do that in the direction of another person. The body has its own timeline. It announced itself on a Wednesday in late February with the specific efficiency of biological processes that have been patient long enough and have decided that patience is no longer serving anyone. I was at the community center. I was in the middle of a relay session with a client who was trying to navigate a housing benefit application, a session that required the sustained split focus of simultaneous interpretation across communication modes, and between one breath and the next, the warmth that I had been managing since October stopped being manageable. It was not dramatic. It was precisely the thing I had been afraid of, the quiet version, the kind that arrived not as a flood but as a fact, the way dawn arrives, incrementally and then completely. The suppressants did not shatter. They simply became inadequate. The way a wall becomes inadequate not when it collapses but when you look at it and understand that the thing pressing against it from the other side is now larger than the wall. I excused myself from the session. I went to the accessible bathroom at the end of the east corridor, and I locked the door, and I stood at the sink, and I looked at my face in the mirror, and I said, silently, to no one, well, the physical signs were already present. The warmth was below my navel now, structural rather than atmospheric, the specific heaviness of an omega body shifting into its biological imperative with the unhurried certainty of something that had been preparing for exactly this. My skin was hypersensitive in the way that preceded heat, every texture registering more acutely than usual, the fluorescent light in the bathroom operating at a frequency I could feel rather than simply see. The first unmistakable signs had started, not the volume of established heat but a clear signal, the specific awareness that my body had shifted at the beginning of the biological cascade my suppressants had been preventing for 6 years. I had 2 days, maximum. That was the standard preheat window, the period before the cycle became unmanageable without intervention. And I knew my own body precisely enough to know that my suppressants were going to stop pretending within hours. I texted Benny first, short and factual, because Benny was the person I went to for practical things, beginning, need to take leave. She responded within 2 minutes, already handled, go home. She had protocols for this because she was Benny, and Benny had protocols for everything, and she was the 4th person of the 7 who knew sign language, and the first person I had ever trusted with the specific vulnerability of my biology. Go home, she texted again, and then, do you need anything? I said no, and then I left the community center. I was outside on the pavement, cold February air cutting through the warmth that was building in my core when I stopped walking. I stood on the pavement outside the community center and I thought about Ryusei and I thought about what I had been not saying for 4 months and I thought about what my body was saying now with the absolute clarity of a system that had stopped asking permission. I texted him, "Something is happening. With my biology. I need to tell you before it gets past the telling stage." His response came in 40 seconds. "I'm coming to you. Where are you?" I typed, "You don't have to." He typed, "Where are you?" I gave him the address. He arrived in 11 minutes in the black car, faster than the traffic math should have allowed, which told me something about how he drove when he had decided somewhere needed to be reached. He found me on the pavement where I was still standing because I had not entirely decided what direction to move in. He came through the car door, and his eyes went over me with the rapid assessment of someone reading a situation, the same sweep I had watched him deploy in other contexts. And his face settled into the focused quiet that meant he had understood the situation and was not going to perform a reaction he did not feel. He signed, wrong in 3 places but completely clear. "You are okay?" I signed back, not an emergency, but starting. He held out his hand. Just that. Palm up, open. The same hand I had grabbed on the train in October without meaning to, offered now deliberately, a question in the shape of a gesture. I put my hand in his, and we got into the car. He drove me home. He came upstairs and he sat on my couch with the same quality of presence he had brought to every space he had occupied in my life since October. Solid and undemonstrative and completely, comprehensively there, and I sat across from him and we looked at each other. I typed, "I've been managing a preheat situation for 4 months. Your pheromone signature interferes with my suppressants. I told you this in November, and the direction of travel was always toward this. Today it arrived." He read this. His face was very still. He typed, "What do you need from me right now?" I read this sentence and felt it move through me. The specific quality of it. The same question he always asked, locating me as a person with a perspective on my own needs rather than a problem requiring a solution imposed from outside. I typed, "I need you to stay. Not because I'm asking you to do anything. Just because the alternative is being alone with this, and I've been alone with all of it for 26 years, and I would like to not be alone with this particular thing." He read this for a long time. He typed, "I'm staying." He stayed. He made tea, finding the kettle and the tin of barley tea by the straightforward method of looking through my cabinets without making a production of it, and he brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from me, and through the preheat warmth that was reorganizing my body's priorities with increasing urgency, I was aware of his pheromone signature at a new level of clarity, the suppressants barely filtering it now, the deep, saturating alpha presence of him filling my apartment with a concentration that my Omega biology was translating directly into need. I was aware, specifically, of his hands, the way they curved around the teacup, the scar tissue across the 3rd and 4th knuckles that I had first felt in the dark on a train, the size of them, warm, large, capable of the precise gentleness I had seen him deploy in signing, and in the careful, tender way he tended to small things. My body was building a comprehensive case for those hands, and the case was very persuasive. I typed, "I should tell you that my suppressants are currently providing approximately the same level of function as a screen door in a typhoon." He read this, and the corner of his mouth moved. He typed, "Is that a problem?" I looked at this sentence. I typed, "That depends on what happens next." He set down the cup, looked at me directly. His eyes were doing the deep water thing with more visible temperature underneath it than I had seen before, the heat that had been there all along showing closer to the surface. He reached across the table and placed his hand, palm up, in the space between us. I put my hand in his. The contact was different than it had been in November on the harbor bench, different than the shrine, different than any of the previous iterations of this gesture that had been accumulating since October. Because the preheat had stripped the insulation from my nervous system, and his pheromones were no longer being filtered, and the warmth between my thighs was no longer a managed fact but a building urgency, and the contact of his skin against mine was conducting heat between us with the directness of something that had been waiting for the insulation to come down. I felt his pulse through my fingers. Elevated, not dramatically, but elevated, the specific biological honesty of a body that was also having a response, an alpha body reading its compatible omega across a kitchen table and not pretending it was unaffected. He typed with his free hand, "Tell me what's happening in your body right now." Not the clinical version, the real one. I looked at this. I typed with my free hand, the other still in his. Warm. In a specific way. Everywhere, but concentrated low. My skin is too aware of everything. The texture of the table, the air temperature, your hand. The suppressants are letting things through that they weren't letting through before. My body is responding to you, not dramatically, but enough to know this is real and not an almost. He read this. Something in his face shifted in a way that was not quite composure anymore. His thumb moved against my palm in a slow, deliberate circle that was very specifically not accidental. I felt it move through my body from the point of contact with a directness that made me press my knees together under the table. He typed, "Can I tell you what I'm experiencing?" I typed, "Yes." He typed, "Your scent has been in my apartment for months, on the coat you left in November. I'm aware of this, and I have been aware of it, and I have not done anything about it because I was waiting for you to tell me what you needed rather than telling you what I wanted. Right now, your scent in this apartment is something I'm experiencing physically rather than peripherally. I'm hard. I've been hard since you got in the car. I'm telling you this because you told me a true thing and you deserve one back." I read this, and the warmth in my body surged with a force that was not subtle at all. I pressed my thighs together more firmly, the warmth between my thighs an insistent fact, and I looked at him across the table, and the thing I had been looking at sideways since October was directly in front of me now, and there was nowhere else to look. I typed, "Come here." He came around the table. He stood in front of me and I stood up from the chair, and we were the same height when I was standing, and his shoes added nothing and mine were flat, and we were face to face with less than a breath between us, and his eyes were asking the same question they had asked on the harbor bench. I answered the same way, by not moving. His hands came to my face with the same careful telegraphed intention of the bench, thumbs at my jaw, fingers in my hair, and the warmth of them against my skin was the thing that broke the last functional remnant of my suppressant wall. The fracture that had been a hairline crack since October became a fissure that ran floor to ceiling, and through it everything I had been maintaining on the other side of it arrived all at once. Not catastrophically, not a flood, but fully, completely, with the quality of something that was always going to arrive and had simply been waiting for the right hands. He kissed me. I had been kissed before. I had not been kissed like this before. He kissed me with the same total attention he brought to everything. His mouth warm and certain and learning me the way he learned everything, with focused, systematic thoroughness. And I felt it from my mouth down through my chest and into the warmth below my navel, where my body was already building the wet, insistent urgency of heat, and the kiss hit that urgency like an accelerant. I made a sound I could not hear. I knew I made it because his chest moved against mine with a sharp inhale, and his hands tightened at my jaw, and the kiss changed, deepened, became something with more of him in it than a first kiss usually carried. Because this was not a first kiss in any real sense. It was a 4-month arrival, and both of us had enough accumulated wanting behind it that the usual architecture of restraint was not going to hold. His hands moved from my face to my waist. He pulled me against him, and I felt the truth of what he had typed across the table, hard against my hip, thick and unmistakable through the fabric between us, and my body responded with a surge of warmth so sudden and thorough that the heat between my thighs became real and present and impossible to manage away. I pulled back enough to see his face. His composure was comprehensively absent, replaced by something I had never seen at full volume in him before, want without containment, hunger without the management strategy around it. And it was the most beautiful thing his face had ever done in all the weeks I had been reading it. I signed, with hands that were not entirely steady, "bedroom." He signed back the word I had taught him first. The simple one. The one he had corrected his hand shape on in a coffee shop in November. Yes. He carried me. I had not expected that. He lifted me with the matter-of-fact ease of someone to whom the physics were straightforward and carried me through my apartment with the same purposeful efficiency he carried through everything, and the warmth of him against my body, and the concentration of his scent at this closeness, and the wet urgency between my thighs, were all converging into something that had stopped being manageable in any category, and was now simply the truth of my body, and his body, and 4 months of building, toward exactly this. He laid me on my bed and came down over me, and the weight of him was the specific overwhelming rightness of an alpha body over an omega body in preheat, my biology receiving it like an answer to every question it had been asking, and I pulled him down further, my hands in the fabric of his sweater, wanting no distance at all between us and the suppressed urgency of my heat, making that want a physical command rather than a preference. He found the hem of my shirt, looked at me, the question visible. I sat up and pulled it off myself, and he looked at me in the low winter light with the expression that was its own category. The deep water quality turned interior and warm, like something had come on inside him that he was not used to having on. His mouth found my shoulder, my throat, the curve where my neck met my collarbone, and his lips sealed there over the scent gland, and the sensation was a bolt of heat, so immediate and so absolute that my back arched off the bed, and a sound worked its way out of me that I registered through my own chest as vibration. His tongue traced the gland, and my hips rose against him without my permission, and the warmth through my body was now unmistakable through 2 layers of fabric, soaking through, warm and insistent, and the physical evidence of a biology that had been waiting since October and had stopped waiting. His hands were on my waist, moving up, his palms flat against my ribs, the warmth of them against skin that was at full heat sensitivity. Every point of contact a current that ran directly between his touch and the warmth coiling in my core. His thumbs traced along my sternum, slow and deliberate, learning the topography with the same patient, thorough attention that characterized everything he did, and I lay beneath him and felt him reading me with his hands the way I read the world, through touch, through surface, through what the body said when language ran out. I reached up and pulled his sweater over his head. His chest was as I had constructed it in 4 months of peripheral knowing, broad and warm and carrying the marks of a life that had been physical in ways that were not always chosen. Old scars, not recent, the geography of survived things, and I pressed my palms flat against them the way I had pressed my palms against aquarium glass to feel what lived on the other side. He looked at my hands on his chest. Something moved through his face. He typed on his phone, which was on the nightstand within reach, with one hand, the other still on my waist. No one has touched me like that, like they wanted to know me. I kept my hands on his chest and felt his heartbeat under my palms, faster than his usual, the elevated truth of a body that was also having an experience it had not had in this particular configuration before. I typed back with one hand, "I've been wanting to do this since the train." He put the phone down, and what followed was everything the 4 months before it had been building toward, and everything the next 4 months would be shaped by, and it was not something I had words for yet, because it existed in the register below words, in the frequencies I had always used, the ones that moved through skin and warmth, and the sustained attention of 2 bodies, learning that they had been reaching for each other since before they had a reason to. He was careful with me the way he was careful with everything he decided mattered. I let him. The heat that had been a managed fact for 4 months stopped being managed and became simply real, and I moved through it with him beside me, and the specific quality of not being alone with the largest thing my body had ever demanded of me was something I had no prior experience of and will spend the rest of my life having feelings about. When the heat broke, on the 3rd morning, I lay in my own bed, with winter light coming through the window, his arm around me, his heartbeat against my back, steady and composed. The same heartbeat I had first felt through his palm on a train in October. He was awake. I knew from the change in his breathing. When I turned, he was already looking at me. The deep water eyes, all their warmth surfaced. The room inside the room, thrown completely open. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, typed, held it so I could see. It said, "Still here." I took the phone, typed, "I know. I can feel your heartbeat." He read this. He looked at me with the expression that had no containment strategy. Then he brought my hand to his chest and held it there, over his heart, and through my palm I felt exactly what I had described, the steady elevated truth of a body that had been alone for a very long time and had found, in the specific accident of a train lurch and a grabbed hand, the place it had been moving toward without knowing it. I typed with my free hand, "You rode 9 extra stops." He typed with his, "I would have ridden the whole line." He came back that evening, and the next day, he came back the way people come back when they have decided where they are going before they leave, with the quality of intention that does not require announcement. He learned new signs every week and signed them wrong, and I corrected his hands and felt them remember. He sat in my apartment on Tuesday evenings and ate whatever I made and argued with me in the notes app with the specific contentious pleasure of 2 people who liked each other's arguments. He held my hand on trains and in harbor parks and at his mother's shrine in January with the December snow replaced by the pale gold light of winter giving way. One morning he signed the word he had learned from a video, wrong in one small particular, the thumb not quite extended. I reached across and corrected it, held his hand in the right shape, pressed my thumb against his, and then I signed it back, against his hand where I was still holding it, so that the sign moved through both of us at once. He brought our joined hands to his mouth and pressed his lips against my knuckles, warm and slow. Through the contact, I felt his heartbeat against my skin, steady and elevated and honest. My name is Sora Yashima. I am 26 years old and I am profoundly deaf, and I spent most of my life becoming very good at reading the world through touch and light and vibration. I read the world through the things that move through surfaces. And I learned, on an October afternoon on the Iraku line, that the most important things have always moved this way. Not in sound, not in the frequencies that were never mine to begin with. Through hands, through skin, through the specific warmth of one person's pulse, moving through another person's palm, saying in the oldest language, I am here, I am here, I am not going anywhere. He grabbed a train pole and I grabbed his hand, and neither of us let go. That was the beginning. The rest was learning each other's language and finding that we had been speaking it all along.